Just wanted to mention a couple of things. First of all, what about our friends from Samoa? Also, some folks have asked about some of the traditions, and I've been asked to let folks know that there is a centering prayer group here available in Anchorage at St. Mary's, and I believe a couple of other places. Do you know? Holy Family? Okay. Any other places that people? Pardon me? The monastery in Eagle River? Okay. Oh, okay. Did everybody hear that? The monastery at 72nd and Lake Otis? So for those of you that are interested in centering prayer or going to another level, obviously it's here as well. So, I also, two other things. There will be a book signing by Kathleen between 4:30 and 5:30. Mass, obviously, is optional for those of you that want to stay at 5:30. I've also twisted Brother Paul's arm. He doesn't even know I twisted his arm. Some of the posters that you've seen around town, I've asked Paul if he would autograph those for you, and he has agreed to do so, haven't you, Paul? Anyway, I don't want to hold this up anymore. Thank you all for staying for what I promise will be more to come. Mary Alice Cook is here to introduce somebody who started this with me, I don't know, 5 or 6 months ago. It's all just kind of blurred. But for those of you that went to Eagle River yesterday, you heard Mary Alice Cook. She's from the community of St. John's in Eagle River, is a renowned historian and also a very close friend of Kathleen's. Mary Alice.
Renowned. I love that. Okay, can I do this without these? No, I don't want to take a chance. I don't want to take a chance. Hello, thank you. Thank you for putting this on. This is awesome, awesomely amazing. 10 years ago, the newspaper of the Archdiocese of Anchorage published a story I wrote about the visit of Father Thomas Merton to the nuns at Eagle River, the sister adorers of the precious blood. Not long after that story appeared, to very little fanfare, I might say, I received a little handwritten card in the mail. Dear Ms. Cook, it said, I read your story about Thomas Merton and his visit to Alaska and would like very much to meet with you to talk about it. How wonderful, I thought. Somebody read my story and liked it and wants to meet you and talk about it. Of course, I said. Of course, I'd love to meet with you. The writer of that note was none other than Kathleen W. Tarr. And little did I know when we sat down together for the first time at Jitter's Coffee Shop out in Eagle River that I was meeting a woman whose encounter with Thomas Merton had changed her life profoundly, who is engaged in a monumental effort to tell that story by weaving it into a memoir of her own spiritual journey. But most special to me, I was meeting someone who would become my steadfast friend and who would let me share some of that journey with her. Now, the first thing one learns about Kathy is that her energy level is high. Very high. Off the charts high. And mine is just the opposite, exactly the opposite. Just in the last 15 years or so, she earned an MFA in creative nonfiction at her hometown school, University of Pittsburgh. She served as the founding program coordinator of UAA's low residency program in creative writing. She has traveled extensively in Russia in connection with her earlier employment with State Chamber of Commerce, right, Kathy? She lived in Poland for a time. She just took up and went. It was such a shock to me. She's like, well, I'm going to Poland. I'm going to stay there for a while, But she went to Poland, and she stayed there for a while, and she immersed herself in the culture, and she wrote, and she just experienced. She was a Mullen Scholar at University of Southern California's Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies. She was named a William Shannon Fellow of the International Thomas Merton Society. And here's where I say there are openings for you to join the Thomas Merton Society local chapter. She founded the Anchorage chapter of that society. It's the first one in Alaska. And there are some materials out on the one of the tables out there. But if you enjoyed this conference, you're going to want to become a part of that and kind of keep this thing going. Go to the International Thomas Merton Society website, and you can find information about it. But we have a chapter of our very own in Anchorage, founded by our very own Kathy Tarr. And so I really urge you to follow up on that. If you're enjoying, obviously you have an interest, so follow up on that. Kathy is currently serving on the board of directors of the Alaska Humanities Forum, very significant organization in Alaska, and she was appointed by the governor to that. She teaches community creative writing classes when she has time, or even if she doesn't have time, she does it anyway, and is a tireless encourager and advice giver to aspiring writers. She has watched her two sons grow up in Alaska and begin to pursue their own dreams, and she rejoiced at the birth of two grandchildren. And she did all of this, while completing the project so dear to her heart, writing her book, We Are All Poets Here, which was published to great acclaim earlier this year by VDP House, and which is available out there. And you're not going to want to leave without it. As I said earlier, I met Kathy when we first sat down together at Jitters Coffee Shop in Eagle River, and over the years we've continued to touch base there whenever we can. She always jokes that it's very fitting for her to hang out at Jitters, a place for over-caffeinated people like herself and like Merton himself. Over-caffeinated, hyper. Over the years, I have been privileged to be among those who were in touch with Kathy as she wrote, rewrote, celebrated the forthcoming publication of the book, went through the laborious process of getting the final manuscript ready for publication, and then celebrating the book's debut right here in Anchorage. And what a book she wrote. Biography, autobiography, memoir, travelogue. A travelogue of Alaska. I've lived here 40-something years, and reading her book made me think, I gotta see Alaska. All woven into a coherent, colorful, and absorbing whole. Among the blurbs, they call them, that I particularly like, the book jacket comment by David Stevenson, who stood out. He said, like all true seekers, Kathleen Tarr's path has been long, surprising, and hers alone. She has gifted her readers with a spiritual biography and a memoir of place. Her connection to Thomas Merton and his little-known Alaska visit is, as the best literary criticism, personal, heartfelt, and organic. So many people have worked so hard to bring all of you folks together for this meeting to focus on Thomas Merton and his Alaska sojourn. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Kathleen Tarr has been the spark, the catalyst for all of us gathering here on this historic weekend, taking part in this tremendous conference on the 50th anniversary of Thomas Merton's Alaska journey. Thanks to Kathy, those words little known will no longer be connected to Merton's Alaska journey. Kathy is a person who brings people together in the pursuit of shared interests, and she fires up everybody else with her singular enthusiasm. I hope Thomas Merton knows how lucky he is to be the object of her admiration and her art. So, obviously, I am very happy and honored today to be the person who says, I give you Kathleen Tarr.
Hi. That was so thorough and so beautiful, all true. She left off one important biographical detail. I'm the biggest Pittsburgh Steelers fan in the whole state of Alaska. Mary Alice, thank you. That was, I didn't see a copy of that in advance, so before I start, oh, he's got the slide up, good. There are so many people to thank, and this is such a special moment. I want to thank all of the people who helped with this conference, all the volunteers. I want to thank this parish and Father Patrick. I want to thank my fellow speakers who have all been tremendous, just tremendous. I am honored to be on this program with all of you. And I especially want to say thank you to my partner in all things Mertonian for the past 3 years almost, and that's Wayne Pichon. Wayne has, Mary Alice talked about how much energy I have, and I am a little bit like that. But Wayne Pichon, in Wayne Pichon, I have met my match, okay? And if Wayne Pichon were an author, okay, a writer, he would have written 120 books to Merton's 60. That's all I could say. Where is Wayne? Is he in here? He went to get more books, you see? You see, it never ends with Wayne. We've been, when we founded the Alaska chapter of the ITMS, we founded it at Holy Family Cathedral. Because this was in October of 2015, and this is a special symmetry because it was the first Archbishop of Anchorage who invited Thomas Merton here. So we wanted to have the first meeting at Holy Family Cathedral. We wanted to have a historic connection that way. And so that's why the first Alaska chapter is there. And Mary Alice, thank you for giving a little commercial about the ITMS, and go to the website. And we have the director of ITMS here, of the Thomas Merton Center, Dr. Paul Pearson, who gave a talk last night. Okay, I was thinking this morning, reflecting on, this is the 50th anniversary year of Merton's visit here, almost precisely to the time. And it would really take us another 50 years to properly put him in context in the legacy of his life and what he left us in his spiritual writings and the spiritual inheritance that we have received from him. We need another 50 years. I have a presentation put together that's kind of a hodgepodge because it was so difficult to do all this as far as how I was going to contextualize it. But I thought we would talk about, first of all, I'm going to talk about what he actually did here in Alaska. When he was here talking to the clergy, to the chaplains, and to the nuns, what he said was, we're going to give a day of recollection. And that is really what we're doing here today, and what we've been doing, is having a day of recollection. So Merton explained to the nuns at Providence Hospital that a day of recollection is when you have total freedom to be a child of God, with some much needed time for reflection, for recovery, to be exactly who you are right now in this moment. Listening, conversing, being fully you, without a mask, without a role to play, without an institution, a system, your employer, your family, no one. Right now, he said in a day of recollection, you are who you are. He said to the nuns in Alaska, sometimes you've got to let things settle down. We do need time to rest, to have some peace and quiet, and to get yourself together. He was advising people to sit in quiet, to recover that balance, to be not pushed around by all these forces in mass society, by the media, by politics, by political factions, but to sit in quiet. I'm probably not the best person to talk to you about sitting in quiet. I realize that. I want to thank, first of all, before we begin these images, I want to also thank the Thomas Merton Legacy Trust and the Thomas Merton Center at Bellarmine University for the images that I am going to be showing you, which I believe perhaps have never been seen, I don't think, in Alaska on a screen before. Some of them are in my book, but there are others that are not. And those images that Merton left on his camera I have access to that because of the Merton Legacy Trust and the research I've been doing. So I want to thank them, first of all, for all the help that I've received. I also want to thank, before I forget, Father Richard Tarot, who is right over there, who is the de facto historian for the Catholic Church, I believe, in Alaska. And he and I also met 10 years ago, and we have kept in touch, and he has helped me a great deal in my life with this book. And when I met with him in Seward earlier this summer, he looked at me and he said, yeah, he saw my book and he goes, you know, that Merton man, he really got his hooks in you. That is so true. That is so true. All right. So I want to call your attention to this a little bit. I have some other images just to start off. I've titled this From the Inner Frontier to the Last Frontier. And that is a very important mountain to me. I call it my mountain. It's Mount St. Elias in Yakutat. And it's 18,008 feet high. It's the third largest, highest mountain in Canada and the United States. Merton did go to Yakutat. We'll talk about that some more as we go along. And he did make a note about this mountain in his journal. When we're talking about the world's highest mountains, we're usually talking about the Himalaya, right? And we talk about those mountains that are 26,000 feet or higher. We call those the 8,000ers, or the 8,000 meters, right? For Merton, I would say that Alaska had the potential to be a spiritual 8,000er. I think what Ron Dart said this morning was interesting. He said that Merton's intellect was like Denali. So when Merton came here, he came to speak to the freezing faithful, but he also came to reconnoiter, if we could use a mountaineering term, the contours of the landscape, to get the lay of the land, to understand more of the intimate details about the geography of this place. And here is a very important thing to know. Alaska was under serious consideration for Thomas Merton. Alaska was not just an extraneous, oh, wow, I have a little fam trip. I'm going to stop in Alaska, on my way to Asia. And, it wasn't just brushed off as a place. This was a serious consideration of Merton's. So Mary Alice mentioned it was a little-known fact about Merton's Alaska experience. So when the official biography was released, an official, sanctioned by the Merton Legacy Trust, 579 pages, The Seven Mountains of Thomas Merton, a thick volume. It's a fantastic biography. Michael Mott is still alive. He did a monumental job. It's wonderful. I got a hold of it, 2 pages on Alaska out of 579. Other people skipped over Alaska too, and the reason is there's just so much to say about Thomas Merton that, I hope I got this right, there's so much to say about him, the biographers had to focus on other things. So here we have the mountain again, and the quote from Merton's journal, quite beautiful. "The clouds opened over Mount St. Elias, and after that, I was overwhelmed by the vastness, the patterns of glaciers, the burnished copper sheen of the sun on the bright blue sea. I kind of call this, this slide was in Dr. Pearson's presentation last night, I kind of call this Merton, the regular guy slide. I'm going to give you a little context before he came here. And as an Alaskan, you know, I've poked fun at Thomas Merton. I don't glorify him, I don't sugarcoat him. As an Alaskan, when I started to read about him being a hermit at the Abbey of Gethsemane, and I thought, give me a break. Because he was a hermit that could walk to the main complex and get his mail. He didn't have to wait for a Bush mail plane to come in. He had friends come by the Hermitage and drop off records and books for him. Some hermit, he had his own literary agent. What hermit has that, you know? And then I thought, well, wait a minute. He doesn't hunt. He doesn't fish. He doesn't have any duct tape. What kind of a hermit is he? He doesn't have extra tufts. You know, I mean, there was on and on. He didn't know how to do a fishing rod. I mean, he couldn't probably run a skiff. You know, he wasn't a pilot. I thought, what a strange hermit. But in all fairness to Thomas Merton, he admitted that he really wasn't a hermit. So right before he came to Alaska on April 18th, 1968, he wrote this in his journal. It was on Easter Thursday, Holy Thursday. He wrote, "The problem of real solitude. Well, I don't have it here. I'm not really living as a hermit. I see too many people. I have too much active work to do. The place is too noisy. It's too accessible. People are always coming here. I have been too slack about granting visits and interviews and going to town too often, socializing, all that. All I have is a certain privacy, but no real solitude is less and less possible here. Everyone knows where my hermitage is. And in May, I'm going to the convent at Our Lady of the Redwoods Monastery in Northern California. And once I start traveling around, well, what hope will there be?" So here is the hermitage. This is the cinder block hut that he lived in from approximately 1965 to 68, right before he came to Alaska. They added, and again, in fairness to Merton, they didn't have indoor plumbing at first when he moved in, and then they added that, and then they added this little extra room chapel. And I have to give Brother Paul Quenon photo credit for this. I'm actually sitting on the porch there, and Brother Paul took this photo of me a couple of years ago, and it was a pretty remarkable experience for me to see that hermitage for the first time. Thomas Merton came to Alaska, I think, at exactly the right time in his life, because perhaps 1968 was the most unhappiest year in American history. When he came, Alaska was like an antidote to what was happening in the lower 48 and the rest of the country. Merton said, "What can be gained by sailing to the moon if we cannot cross the abyss that separates us from ourselves?" In my work, I have referred to him as the ceaseless explorer, the comeback monk, because when he was on his way here into Asia, that inner restlessness that he had always struggled with, always combated in himself, came back. We have to remember this about his trip to Alaska. He did not come here as a religious celebrity. In fact, his abbot forbid him to make any television interviews, any radio interviews, or any newspaper reporters. They, as we put in Alaska lingo, he flew under the radar screen. Quite as much of a natural person as he could be, of course, the local Catholics knew who he was, right? But nobody else knew who he was. And everyday Alaskans didn't really know about him. And that was okay because, you know, that's the Alaska way of life, isn't it? We don't get gaga over celebrities. We're not that impressed when celebrities come to Alaska, especially when they come in the summer, because we think that's kind of the wimpy time to come. I mean, if you're really interested in Alaska, you don't come in the summer, you come in January, okay? Be tough, And so, in Alaska, if you are a big celebrity, or you do have a high opinion of yourself, Alaska is a great place to adjust your perspective. To be reminded of just how unimportant you really are. Here's the inside, just a quick look at the Hermitage today, where Brother Paul will talk more about that. When I went to visit, this is going to be connected to Alaska. I went into the chapel at the Hermitage, and I was completely mesmerized and dumbfounded. Merton, I already knew this from reading his journals, that he had been given an icon back in the mid-'60s by a good friend of his. It's hard to see in this picture. There's a closer-up picture of it. It's an icon of the Old Testament prophet Elias being carried in a chariot by angels to heaven, lifted in the divine mystery. I just showed you a picture of Mount St. Elias. And here we have in Merton's chapel an icon of Elias, which he received before he came to Alaska. So this completely flabbergasted me. What were the odds that the only one of two icons he had would be of Elias? And then he came here and he saw the mountain Elias. Talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, let's go straight to the 1960s a little bit. Here we go. What else can we say about the 60s that hasn't already been said? It was a ball of confusion, was it not, for just about everybody. Look at what was going on in the 60s. To put in context his arrival here, we've already had the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., we've had Robert Kennedy being killed, we've had the Prague Spring, we had the Democratic National Convention, uprisings in France, the draft card burnings, and on the popular front with films, we had 2001: A Space Odyssey. First black American woman elected to the U.S. House of Congress, Shirley Chisholm. We are all poets here, I've got to mention, Leonard Cohen had a book. Gary Snyder's poetry book, The Backcountry, was published. Teachings of Don Juan, Carlos Castaneda. Jimi Hendrix music, Hair. John Lennon and Yoko Ono's famous picture being in the bed in New York City that went all over the place. And Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire all came out in 1968. So it seemed like America was suffering from a kind of neurosis, We had like a spiritual crisis and identity crisis, one after another. But when Merton was here on the ground, he joked that you Alaskans, you don't have the luxury of dealing with any spiritual identity crisis because you have all those Kodiak brown bears running around breathing down your neck. You can't have an identity crisis. Well, 1968 was a very, very important year in my life, which is why, again, when I started to learn about Merton and his visit here, and I thought about my own life, where was I in 1968? Well, I was in Pittsburgh, first of all, and I was just coming into my preteens. And I was looking at newspapers and magazines and looking at commercials on TV, and, there was a lot going on in the country, and I was thinking, well, I'm going to make my mark on the world. I'm going to be somebody really, big and special in my family and all this. And I didn't have a clue who I was, but this is the kind of atmosphere in my youth, up from the time from 68, for probably the next good 10 years until I got to Alaska in 1978. There we go. That's where I was. Smash the patriarchy. I was kind of a radical young feminist at that time, and it was the irony of coming to Alaska, which this was a man's world, and here I came, and I came with a round-trip ticket, as I wasn't sure if I would stay, and then I cashed it in, and I thought, well, Gloria Steinem wrote a lot of work, but she didn't write enough about the women in Alaska. So I'm going to go find out what these women are all about. Okay, so Alaska at that time was also smashing some stereotypes because, you know, we were thought the backwoods. We were thought culturally backward. Nobody came here but salmon fishermen. There were a lot of Eskimos. I mean, this was the general stereotype, right? But suddenly, the year Merton arrived, in June, right before Merton arrived, I think it's important to note, that is when oil was discovered in Prudhoe Bay. And Alaskans were jubilant. The rest of the country falling to pieces. Not Alaskans. We were the opposite. We were like, oh my goodness, we have an economy. We had a lot of serious land issues that had to be solved, but we had a future. Thomas Merton didn't give a damn about oil pipelines. Not at all. He was more concerned with the military's presence in Alaska. Very concerned. Not about oil. He didn't even, I haven't found one comment about oil. But I have to say, while we have this Ms. Magazine up there, that Merton, he's been, you know, ahead of his times in so many ways. He was very sensitive to women's issues. He held a few retreats at the Abbey of Gethsemane for some nuns. They had to get special permission to do that because women weren't allowed to go to the Abbey of Gethsemane on retreat till quite some time later. And then, of course, he did talks and conferences to the nuns here. And when he was in Alaska, for all of you special women out there, it'll be nice for you to know that he mentioned his favorite mystic was Julian of Norwich from the 14th century in England. So he knew about Julian of Norwich, and I'm sure Catherine of Siena, and I'm sure Teresa Avila, and all of the rest, too. All right, we already talked about this. I'll skip by. Merton in 1968 was a very, very busy monk. These were all published just in 1968. These are Buddhist monks. They're making a sand mandala. It's very intricate design, and I got to watch some monks, Buddhist monks, do this in Louisville at a conference. And the idea is you make this design, it's gorgeous, and then they walk to the river or wherever and they completely destroy it. It's gone. Nothing permanent, impermanent. When Merton came to Alaska, his study of Buddhism was reaching an apex. Here is the beautiful thought. Merton's interest in Buddhism was so strong and powerful. And where does he come? He stops in Alaska on his way to Asia because he wanted to meet Buddhists face to face. He didn't meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama until after he left Alaska. But that was his intention, to meet people face to face. He was reading the Japanese poet Basho for a time too. He would have really appreciated that Alaska was the first state in the United States to open a trade office in Japan. And Alaska is the crossroads between East and West. It is here, where we are. So it's interesting for me to be on the schedule between the Samoan choir and a Kentucky monk, right in the middle, and that's exactly where I should be. We talked about his interfaith explorations. It hasn't been mentioned that when Merton was baptized as a Catholic at Corpus Christi Church in 1938, his three close friends were witnesses to his Catholic baptism. They were all Jews. So Merton is really fascinating when it comes to his interfaith. These are real and genuine friendships that were so important to him. Robert Lax, who became a poet and somewhat of a hermit living in Greece, probably Merton's closest, longest time friend, was there for him at Corpus Christi Church. Okay, so he spent a lot of time studying Buddhism, and I just want to say that he understood that Buddhism is not a theology. Buddhism is not rules. Buddhism is not doctrines. Nothing like that. He was getting this from a lot of books that he was reading, but when he came to Alaska, he wasn't interested in doing that much reading on the ground here, even though he always traveled with armloads of books. He learned from Buddhists this notion of direct seeing, unfiltered seeing, pure seeing, letting your mind just, whatever comes in, let it go. Detaching from all those things that keep us prisoner, psychological prisoners. Merton had a real insight on this. All right, let's get to where he was going. Well, we all as Alaskans know where we're located on the face of this earth, but a lot of people don't know. I put this in here just to talk about the mileage that Merton covered in 1968. Listen, he went to Kentucky, then he went to California and New Mexico. He flew back to Kentucky, then left Kentucky, went to Chicago, flew from Chicago to Anchorage. Then once he was in Anchorage, he will talk about where he went. He circled a lot of places. And then after this, he went to Thailand, then he went to India, he went to northern India, he went to see some of the Himalaya, he went to a tea plantation, then he went to Sri Lanka, then he went back. Do you know how many miles we're talking about here? I mean, he would be, in the Million Miler Club practically, right? With Alaska Airlines, he flew so much. So I think that people in the lower 48 who have studied Merton have no concept of the scale of things, where Alaska is, how far he went, and what he did here. I think it's just a remarkable story. Alaskans, as we know, are flying people. Right? We fly everywhere. I mean, infants 3 days old get on airplanes here. All right, so speaking of airplanes, this is the airplane that Merton, this is a model of the airplane. This is not the actual airplane. Piper Aztec that he flew around in Alaska. The Archbishop provided a charter plane for him and his own pilot for a lot of it. And so that's like being treated like a celebrity, right? But the Archbishop was really an interesting man, and it was great that he provided this support for Merton. Merton says that a couple of things from his journal. Alaska is certainly the most beautiful part of America. This is wild, grand, and exciting country, he said. Alaska's mountains have the Swiss Alps beat by miles. Now, he was here in September, as we all know, and if you are in Alaska in September and you're at an airport, this is what you might see. The moose hunters are here. I saw this 3 days ago at the Anchorage airport. Okay, those are moose racks, antlers 60 inches, 2 of them. Do you see the duct tape? That's checked as baggage on Alaska Airlines. Can you believe it? This is Alaska. I love it. But Merton ate moose. Merton had moose when he was here. And he put in his journal, I ate moose, but I didn't get any bear. But he had the moose. Okay. Where did he go? You have this in your program, so I don't need to spend a lot of time with this. But you can get an idea of the miles that he covered. I've already talked about this. He didn't make it to the Arctic. He stayed primarily around South Central. As far in Southeast as he went was Juneau, and as far as Western Alaska, Dillingham, Yakutat, Cordova, Copper Valley, Anchorage, a little bit of the Kenai Peninsula. All right, I'm gonna switch gears here a little bit and tell you a personal story. This is my epiphany. If I can get this is it. This was the book that did it for me. To give you a little perspective, At the time, I wanted to sort of explain to you what my spiritual state of being was. I had no spiritual state of being when I found this book. I was in graduate school. I was trying to become a writer. Things weren't going so well. I was finishing my thesis, and I was very stressed out for a lot of reasons. And whatever spiritual water I had evaporated. I was in a terrible frame of mind. I grew up in a secular household. I raised 2 sons in a totally secular household. I never owned a Bible. I never read a spiritual book except Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. That's the only one. I was a late bloomer to college, 47 years old and getting my master's. I didn't like anything that was going on in 21st century America. We had Islamic fundamentalists. We had 9/11. The media I felt like the media was encroaching more and more upon my life. We had so much consumerism. I had an overall weariness of what was going on, but on top of all those external factors, my mother was diagnosed with liver cancer, and she was given a prognosis of only a few years to live. At the same time, my teenage niece, Daisy Lee, had a brain tumor, and she wasn't doing well. And then there's this story that kind of relates to what some of the speakers, I think was Gordon this morning, was talking about this, and we've talked about identifying with the other. At the time that I turned to this book to read it for the first time, my only brother was a military vet, and he was living on disability checks and in a very dilapidated trailer in Florida. And I was in grad school, so I couldn't visit him. Later, when I finally got a chance to visit him, to try to help him, I found that he was living in this trailer with an unemployed prison ex-convict and his drug-addicted girlfriend. They were all living in my brother's small trailer, and my brother was sleeping on a couch that looked like it should have been sent to the Goodwill a long time ago, and he had his cat. And there was garbage and filth and cigarette butts like 4 inches deep, dishes that hadn't been washed in weeks and weeks. And there was my brother, who had nothing. And he took these people in. And of course, I show up as his big sister. And I start bossing him around, because what are you doing? What is wrong with you? You can't have these people share your home like this. You don't have anything. But my brother insisted. He said, Kathy, those people, they're down and out a lot more than I am. He believed in Jesus, and he would talk to me about Jesus all the time. And of course, I thought he was nuts. Why are you always talking about Jesus? I would say to my brother. I mean, Jesus is talking to him, he said. Well, my brother was also a paranoid schizophrenic, so I didn't put a lot of, I just thought he was crazy. But anyway, that moment of going into that trailer ended up being a pretty important moment for me to understand what my brother was talking about. And then along came Merton. I picked up this book, walked into a bookstore in Pittsburgh, because I wanted to know about him as a writer. I was trying to be a writer. How come his book is on the bestseller list? How come this book is on the best books of the 20th century? Who's this Thomas Merton dude anyway? I didn't have any idea, and I was trying to get some answers. So I picked this book up, and I delved into it, and then I didn't stop. I've talked to a couple of other people here who had kind of the same experience with this book. And it struck me how many times in this book Merton's talked about his stupid will, his stupid self, his stupid decisions, and his stupid judgments. And I said, that sounds just like me. So I was captivated by Thomas Merton first as a writer. Who goes to Columbia University, gets that kind of pedigreed education, gets an academic appointment at St. Bonaventure's, gets a professorship, right, on his way to getting one, and then decides, no, I'm going to give up my material possessions. I'm going to become chaste, and I'm going to join these malnourished monks in Kentucky. And so, right at the peak of his sexuality, right at the peak of the time when he might become a parent or a husband, a boyfriend, something. And no, he decides, he could bum around Europe and, have some good times, but no, he decides to become a monk. This really, really got my attention after I read this book. I came back to Alaska, and then I forgot about Merton. And then I went to the Lusac Public Library one day, and I checked out a book called Republic of Rivers, a nature anthology. And Merton's name was in an Alaska nature book, and then I just flipped. I said, what is he doing in this book? I have lived in Alaska since '78. I never heard of Thomas Merton coming to Alaska. I don't understand it. There was an editor's note. Oh yeah, he came to Alaska. I was at home, I was in bed, I was reading this book, and then I saw the dateline, Yakutat. That was it, because Yakutat was where I lived when I first came to Alaska. This is the book I got next, and probably the book that most of you will want to get eventually too. You can still find it. This is the Alaska Journal of Thomas Merton. There is so much to say about this journal. I can't do it here in this context. I'm just going to give you a little highlights. My copy, I took all my other notes out. I've carried this around for 12 years. 12 years. I'm still not done with it, because there is so much poignancy in Merton's conferences that he gave here, which are included in the appendix, and his notations of where he went in Alaska and what he said, that I think that, like I said, I might need 50 more years to go through it. I want to take 1 minute, I'll try to do this as quickly as possible, to read. We talked about, someone asked about his relationship to his abbot. He actually had 3 different abbots throughout his monastic life at Abbey of Gethsemane. The last abbot is Father Flavian Burns, who was also Merton's confessor, I believe, or vice versa, however you say that in monks' terms. Anyway, he wrote to his abbot from Anchorage on September 26, 1968. I'm just going to read you a little bit of it. I have seen quite a lot of the area within a 500-mile radius of Anchorage. This includes a lot of wild mountains, a mountain range bigger than the Swiss Alps, another range where the highest mountain on this continent is found, a rugged coastline with thousands of isolated bays and islands and glaciers, a few fishing villages that can only be reached by air and a long boat trip. I have yet to see and explore more of those bays and islands in southeast Alaska, and have a hunch that near, and these are his words, near a half-breed village of fishing people called Yakutat, totally isolated, he says, I might find a place there. The bishop is extremely generous and good. He's very interested in having contemplatives here. My feeling at present is that Alaska is certainly the ideal place for solitude in the hermit life. In fact, it is full of people who are in reality already living as hermits. In conclusion, though, I am not in a position to decide anything yet. I believe that if nowhere else, there is certainly real solitude in Alaska, and that it would be very easy to settle here. Also, apart from that, I think that Alaska is a place where God is calling some to solitude. And as to the material problems, people are very resourceful in Alaska in handling them, and very cooperative with one another, so that when anyone is in trouble, they will always come to his assistant by plane or skiff or however. To my knowledge, there was only one review that ever appeared in the Alaska press about the Thomas Merton Alaska Journal, which the journal was published about 25 years after his death under Merton's wishes, 1989, by New Directions Press, who was also the primary publisher for Merton's poetry and poetry-related works. Here's what the reviewer from Fairbanks, Marjorie Cole, became a professor at UAF. She's now deceased, unfortunately. She wrote, Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk and prolific author, came to Alaska in September 1968 looking for a site for his new hermitage. He spent 2 weeks here visiting Juneau, Cordova, Yakutat, Eagle River, and Dillingham. Alaska thrilled him to the core. This is a wild, grand, and exciting country, he writes. He had lived in Gethsemane Abbey for 25 years and very quickly realized that his growing desire for a change would be rewarded in Alaska. Whatever else I may say, it is clear that I like Alaska much better than Kentucky, and it seems to me that if I am to be a hermit in the United States, Alaska is probably the best place for it. I rest my case. Okay. This has been mentioned by Professor Ron Dart, and I want to talk about this. The Russian influence, of course, is everywhere in Alaska, and this is a picture I took. I didn't take. Excuse me. This is not for me. This is Mount Redoubt in the background, and this is Old Town Kenai. I used to live in Kenai, and these kinds of images are all over the state. And Merton, he had this big interest in orthodoxy, and of course we know he corresponded with Pasternak and all that, and that part of that story is in my book, and I just put this in there to remind us of that Russian history. And here we go, and here's another one, which is the review of, which is the Kodiak Church. I took that. That's a current photo of the Kodiak Church. And the reason that I'm mentioning the Kodiak Church here is because in Merton's journal in Alaska, he is told that there is an old Russian monk living near Kodiak. And Merton really wanted to meet this monk. And it's pretty amazing that, and when you think about the history of Kodiak, the Russian monks came in 1794 from Valum near Finland. By foot, horse, and river, they crossed the entire Russian landmass, got to Kamchatka, or the Sea of Okhotsk, and then went all the way around the Aleutians, and ended up in Kodiak. It's quite an amazing story. So they basically axed their way across the wilderness. This is the monk Merton wanted to meet in Alaska. Father Gerasim, who lived on Spruce Island and also Afognak and also Helsinki for a part. Mary Alice Cook and I did a pilgrimage out there 2 summers ago because we wanted to see this place where this starets lived, and the one that Merton wanted to meet. He died 1 year after Merton was here. More about this. This is from my collection. I don't know if you can see it. This is the replica icon of the Russian monks originally coming to settle in Alaska and begin their missionary work. They're on the skiff, and there's a seal, and there's the Big Dipper in the waves. It's a beautiful icon. Of course, one of those monks on that boat becomes the first Russian Orthodox monk canonized in North America, our beloved monk and saint, Herman. And when you were on the Eagle River field trip yesterday, you would have seen icons of St. Herman in the chapel and in the church. And the monk whose picture I showed you, Father Gerasim, was living on Spruce Island, keeping the flame alive of the memory of St. Herman. That's why he came to live there. All right, onward. I love this picture of Merton because I call this his cool cat bohemian look. He's got that black turtleneck sweater on, and he's a jazz lover too, as you know. So anyway, on his way to Alaska, he had in his words, because he said this to the people I have a record of this, he said, he was telling a story. He said, when I boarded my flight in Louisville, I had a Negro stewardess, and she saw me in this black turtleneck, and she came up to me and she said, Mr. Merton, are you a philosopher? And and they sat down and had a conversation. And he liked to not travel with his Roman collar. He told the Alaskans, I want to have a natural conversation. I don't want to have a stilted conversation. So he often traveled without it. Before he came to Alaska, he was given this gift of this 35 millimeter camera. And here he is fiddling with it. I'm not sure what year this was. Paul Pearson knows. I'm going to guess it's 67, 68 that he took this. All right, so he had the camera. He comes to Alaska, drinks some Bloody Marys on the plane on the way up. We swung slowly down into Anchorage and got out into the cold, clear autumn air. Everywhere the leaves have turned, gold of the aspens and birches everywhere. Drove out Route 1 to the convent at Eagle River. It is a nice house among the birches at the foot of the mountains, looking out through the trees toward Cook Inlet and Mount McKinley. I have a great sense of warmth and generosity in the clergy here. All are very eager to help, and I feel that they are eager to have me settle here, he said. Again, I have no religious background, so when I went to Merton, and when I heard that the name of the monks there that he had his conferences, some of his conferences with, were the Sisters Adorers of the Precious Blood, it really scared me. I didn't understand what that meant. I thought, wow, that was really... Anyway, I have recently been in touch with the Mother House in Canada. I have sent them some information, and I'm in touch with the nuns. Of course, as you know the story, these nuns left because of the water supply was not good, and they could not really lead a semi-cloistered contemplative life. Here they are. Mary Alice has done wonderful work in her research, and Mary Alice has helped me a lot in my work, sharing information about what the nuns said in their newsletter about Merton. And they're also called, Far Lake nuns. Okay, so Mary Alice, I have to credit with this story. So one of the nuns, when Merton came to Eagle River for 4 days, one of the nuns was asked to mend a pair of his socks. And she never gave them back. She kept them as a relic. Mary Alice and I have been trying to find these socks for quite a while. The nuns, Merton's relationship to nuns I find really fascinating, and please don't think of this in a sexist way, because I don't think it really is, and I'm a feminist, so I don't think it's sexist what he said. When he wrote letters to his friends about nuns, he called them affectionately the nunnies. Anyway, in the Redwoods Monastery, one of the nuns was asked, what about Merton? What is his greatest gift? And the nun said, his greatest gift was to call forth the greatest gifts that are in each of us, those gifts that God has given us. This is the room he spoke in Eagle River. Some of you were there yesterday. That's what we call the big room at the St. James House now. Merton would give his talks in there. He'd look out the window. He could see McKinley. And of course, when Merton was here, it wasn't any day like this. It was 40s, blustery, windy. He didn't have the kind of September that we've had. That's an icon of St. Herman on the left, by the way. This is a look of inside the church there that wasn't there when Merton was there. But again, I'm showing this to you because this is where we went on a field trip yesterday. Look at the icons. Merton, there's such a symmetry here. Merton having icons, then coming here, now there being an Orthodox cathedral there with icons. So I put that in there in case you didn't get to see it yesterday. There's the chapel that's in the woods now. An Orthodox chapel painted by, the icons are painted by a Russian iconographer. The other icons in St. John by a woman iconographer, Robin Armstrong, who spoke yesterday and does beautiful icons. All right, now we're getting to historical photos. There is Thomas Merton in the center. On the left is Father Tom Connery, who founded St. Elizabeth Ann Parish. We read a letter, Father Patrick read a letter by him yesterday. There they are downtown at the Archbishop's house having dinner. A couple of quick facts. Interesting for Merton. This archbishop, the first one in Anchorage, was from New York, okay? And so was Merton. He spent a lot of years in New York. And our first archbishop was a Navy chaplain in World War II, 1943 to 46. He took part in the Marine landing at Okinawa. And then from 66 to 75, he was in Anchorage. He's the one who invited the Dominicans here. He's the one who gave the 5 acres for this place to start, and he died in 2000 at age 86, and he left no survivors. Here's another picture of Merton with some of the nuns here. Not a very good one. He's there on the right. All right, now we get into the really good stuff. Okay. Images that were on Merton's camera in 1968. Left after he died, of course. So I saw this image. I went to the Thomas Merton Center, and I was looking at images and I couldn't believe this because it just looked so familiar to me. Like, where is that? And I think, is that Yakutat? Looking at that, is that the Yakutat Boat Harbor? I moved to Yakutat as a newlywed in February of 1979 when I thought I was going to have a big career and be a big somebody. I went to Yakutat. And I became a fish slimer. That's where I learned how to wear extra tufts. Yakutat became for me my spiritual home. So here is Merton taking a picture at this boat harbor. I had a 35mm camera. I was there 11 years later when I moved there. I had a dark room. I was really into photography. I stood in the same spot that Merton. Look at this. This picture on the left is two boats in the Yakutat boat harbor. Tommy Boy. Merton took the photo. He took that because the boat's called Tommy Boy, and he got the biggest kick out of that. I showed this picture to Lieutenant Governor Byron Millott because he is from Yakutat. I knew him in Yakutat long before he became Lieutenant Governor. And he told me the whole story about this boat, Tommy Boy. And there's another really important Yakutat thread here. So I lived in Yakutat for about 4 years with my then husband and learned to be an Alaskan. Lived in this exquisite scenery with Mount St. Elias, in St. Elias country, as the Tlingit people call it. The St. Elias dancers, the indigenous culture. I learned all of these things from Yakutat. Also in Yakutat, I worked for this school. I was a librarian, even though I wasn't trained. And they just said, be the librarian. So I was. And at that time, I befriended the Ryman family. Now, unless you've read the Alaska Notebook of Merton's, you won't know the name Ryman, maybe. But Rymans were one of the handful of Catholic families that lived in Yakutat. And Frank Ryman was the man who offered Merton private land for his hermitage, trying to convince him to come to Yakutat. But Merton didn't take him up on the offer because he didn't want to be a pastor necessarily to local people. He wanted to really be a hermit. But as I was working on my book, I would go back to Yakutat a lot for my spiritual replenishment. And I would stay at the Ryman's cabin. When I lived in Yakutat, I never heard of Thomas Merton. So because I didn't learn about Merton until 2005. While I'm here, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Frank Ryman's son, Skip Ryman, and his wife, Rosemary Ryman, who have been my friends since I moved to Yakutat in 1979. And it was his father that offered him the land. So Skip and Rosemary, they flew up from Yakutat to be here. Would you please just stand up for a second? Thank you. That's it. Go. Yeah. Some of the best Catholics you'll ever meet right there. I have to tell you a story about the Rymans. They owned a lodge in Yakutat. They hosted Thomas Merton for a meal. They were sitting down to the meal near the Yakutat airport, and the cook came out and served Merton the food. And Merton looked at the cook and the server and said, wow, well, what's that? And the cook said, oh, that's shit on a shingle. And Skip's mother was mortified, absolutely mortified, and Merton just laughed hilariously at that. Okay, let's see, what do we have? So this is a picture of Thomas Merton taken when he was flying around Alaska. There he is in his Roman collar. That's the only one that exists that we know of in Alaska, like this picture of him. I'm not sure what the mountain is. I've been asking all the mountaineers, is it Mount Sanford? Is it Mount Drum? We don't know. I don't not quite know what mountain that is. So as we go through these, I have tried to identify the locations, but holler out if you know. These are from Merton. Whoops. Okay, I think it's the dock in Valdez after the earthquake, because he was here in '68, and it looks like the image. Not sure if that's Valdez, but these are all photos by Merton. Another one. Worthington Glacier, possibly. I've talked to a few people about this image. We're not sure, but there. Another photo he took of a glacier. Could be. It could be Portage, because he did go around Portage, and, it doesn't look anything, right? Now it doesn't look anything like it would have looked in '68 because the ice is all melted. This is great. Redoubt. A handsome and noble mountain in the distance, but ugly and sinister as you get near it. A brute of a dirty, busted mountain that has exploded too often. A bear of a mountain, a dog mountain, with steam curling up out of the snow crater. And as the plane drew near, there was turbulence, and we felt the plane might at any moment be suddenly pulled out of its course and hurled against the mountain. Redoubt, a volcano to which one says nothing. September 30th. Okay, here he is flying out. This is Mount, of course, Augustine. Beautiful photo by Merton, don't you think? This is the church in Dillingham. I went to Dillingham because I was retracing Merton's steps, right? And I put this in here because Thomas Merton said that the churches in Alaska were poverty-stricken. This is actually a very nice church building. Father Tom Connery said when he went to give Mass there once, he walked up the steps and there was a dripping moose carcass hanging right there in the front of the church. And he had to call the state trooper to come and get the moose carcass off the Catholic church porch. But anyway, in Dillingham there is a Russian Orthodox church. Merton makes a comment about that in his journal. This is Lake Alignagik. I went out there to retrace his steps. Like I said, Merton thought that Lake Alignagik was beautiful. He loved that area out there. He said it reminded him of Siberia, and that also Lake Alignagik speaks to him, he said. I took that photo. Now we're back to Anchorage. In the mountains of Anchorage, the Chugach Mountains, Merton wasn't aware of what was really going on. And Mount Gordon Lyon, now a part of J-Bear, Merton was very disturbed by the military's presence. He did go, I believe, to the military base for a meal, but little did Merton know that in those peaceful hills above Anchorage, we had a Nike Hercules missile summit. We had a launch facility. We had, this is the tracking radar. This is the building. I've taken a tour up there. I'm sure some of you have. This is what Merton, it was here when Merton was here, but he didn't know about this. So there were all these missiles that were ready to be launched to any Soviet jets that invaded our airspace. They were ready to go. Merton, as you heard, was very vocal about the Vietnam War, the Cold War, and wanted us basically to not have any war at all. But Alaska's military importance as a strategic location cannot be ignored. A couple years ago, I had my Russian friends from Moscow, and we walked around. So you see how history just comes full circle. They are our enemies. Now these are my friends. And now they're looking at the missile launch facility. It's pretty incredible. This is the Eklutna Church today, and I put that in here because this is the Eklutna Church that Merton took. I didn't realize this, but the Eklutna Church, which is a combination of Russian Orthodox and Athabascan, is the oldest, I've been told, Russian church in Anchorage, older than the other ones you might see. I just gave a talk in Nome at the Historical Society, and when I was in Nome and showed this picture, there is a native man right there speaking to a nun. The nun drove Merton to the Eklutna church. In the audience that day was a gentleman from the Anchorage Museum, Director of Culture and History, Aaron Leggett. Aaron Leggett is the president of the tribe at Eklutna. He was at my talk. He said that was his great-great-uncle. And his uncle lived near the church and opened it for Merton when he came. More of these scenic shots from Merton. We don't know where this range is. I can't really to tell you know how many mountains we have in Alaska. It's kind of hard to know sometimes. Here's another one from Merton. Anybody have a guess on what that might be? I have no idea. David Stevenson, I've been trying to bug him to help me with this. All right, Merton mentions this in his journal. And I have to thank Father Richard Tarot for this, too. Merton went to Cordova. Cordova was one of the places Merton was seriously considering, Eyak Lake in Cordova. Because why? Because Cordova was an easy plane ride from Anchorage. He wouldn't have to be a real hermit in the sense of, somebody up there in the Arctic or anything. And he could get supplies and mail, and there was Alaska Airlines early days flights and all that. Anyway, Segundo Lorente was the pastor in Cordova when Merton came and they met. Segundo Lorente is famous in Alaska. He was the first Catholic priest ever elected to any state legislature. And he was in Nome at the time. And he spent 35, 40 years on the Yukon River in some very harsh and remote places. And I read this memoir thanks to Father Richard Tarot. And that's Merton's quote from it. So they met. And he's a legendary priest, a Jesuit in Alaska. This is the reason Merton would have had a hard time being out in the boonies, because he really was afraid of bears. There's a couple of things I want to talk about before we get to the end of this very soon here. Why Merton would have returned. Here are my quick reasons why. His interest in indigenous cultures definitely would be one of the reasons he would return. Also because of our mountains. Mountains would have wooed him back. Absolutely. His ecological awareness, his new ecological awareness, Alaska was the perfect place for that. Also, he'd have a much better protein diet if he came here and he had some salmon. And he would be inspired to write more poetry had he stayed here. Here's a view, again, of Mount St. Elias, near Mount St. Elias, Hubbard Glacier, and taken by the USGS in the 1930s. And look at this poem by Merton, Road with Mountains, Alaska. The old monk is turned loose and can travel. He's out to see the world. What progress in the last 30 years. But his mode of travel is still the same. I will let you to make your own interpretation of that kind of Zen poem that he wrote. This is my favorite photo on Merton's film from Alaska. There it is. It is a nun in her habit, with her veil, maybe in Hatcher Pass, not sure, very artistic. Merton's parents were both bohemians and artists, and I just think this is absolutely beautiful. So in conclusion, His Holiness the Dalai Lama at Merton's grave. When Merton was here, as I said, he was talking about Buddhism to some of the nuns and some of the priests here. And he said he's very uncomfortable saying that Catholics are right and Buddhists are wrong or anything like that. He said that Buddhists really challenge him to get right to the heart and depth of it. So I have a special audio that we want to play. Merton speaking to the nuns in Alaska, and I hope the quality is good. Listen to what he says to the religious people of Alaska.
Actually, what he's talking about is something quite different. He's not talking about a purely rational argument. What all these people are looking for is some evidence that you know this God who is beyond beginning and all that sort of stuff. And not that you can explain it, but that you know it. And they can tell in some way. That's what Zen is all about. They have a sort of a radar thing that spots this.
That's all right. We'll stop it.
Whether you're on the level or not.
Thank you.
That's the whole thing in Zen. It has nothing
Okay,
to do
so we'll just skip that. It is very profound what he says, because he tells them at the end about we could be trading places to anyone who's down and out, the poor, the oppressed, and anyone. And what the religious need to do is to create an environment for reconciliation, and that's the message that he gives them. So in closing, there's Mount St. Elias again. Too often we are content to maintain a fairly decent level and never surpass it. But our life demands breakthroughs. Not every day, not every week, not every month, but once in a while we must break through and go beyond where we are. You have to build up all you have done and push through with it, and then you can find that you are out of the woods in a new clearing. You are somewhere else, developing a new way. That's what he said to the nuns. And so finally, I hope that this means something to you. Merton never, ever imagined he would come to Alaska, that he would end up in Asia, that he would meet real Buddhists, that he would do any of these things. But in the wild enchantment of life, your spiritual mentors can come from the most unpredictable people, in the most unpredictable places, and in the most unpredictable times. We only need to pay attention. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. We're going to stay on point with Father protocol. We have some refreshments downstairs. I want to acknowledge our brothers from Thailand. These are Buddhist monks from Thailand, and I think it's just so incredibly symbolic that Martin's journey ended in Thailand. There are two people on, actually, there's a single individual, because the other person isn't here, that I would like to especially recognize. Hannah, would you come up here? I'd also like to offer a very personal thank you to Eric Wolford from the Carolyn Fanneman Wolford Foundation at St. John's Episcopal Church for Christian education. Early on, Eric believed in what Kathleen and I wanted to try to do, so much so that he donated 50 scholarships. Many of you in this room today are here because of the generosity of Eric Wolford. To our I need a nap. To our musicians, my goodness, from yesterday as well as the Samoan choir, oh my goodness. You made our worship even more fulfilling. To our speakers and introducers, without you, there would have been no celebration. To my wife Barb and Marie Lawley, to the St. Elizabeth Social Committee and all the wonderful volunteers and cookie bakers, you kept us fed and happy. Barb? You know, there was a time in our life when she said, "Don't bring me flowers. Don't bring me flowers. Just be present." And I was traveling anywhere between 150 and 250,000 miles a year in my profession, and I forgot what was really important. To the Knights of Columbus, and especially Kevin Adler, your patience with an ever-changing attendee list and the lunches you provided for all of us are beyond appreciated. To my dear friend Kathleen, who along with me believed we had to do this celebration, my deepest gratitude and appreciation. Please come forward and stay here with me for a moment. Stay with me. Every conference like this has to have someone who keeps it going in spite of the frustrations and setbacks. That person was Carrie Robichaux. Her tireless efforts, positive attitude, and undaunted perseverance made this celebration possible. Join me in thanking this wonderful child of God. Oh my God. Oh my. Did anybody, this is being recorded, isn't it? And now before I turn this over to my friend, Brother Paul, a quick story. I met Paul about a year and a half ago at the ITMS meeting at St. Bonaventure University. He and his friend Rob invited me to go to lunch with them. We settled on a small bar in Olean where Paul had a couple of adult beverages. I didn't say 6. A couple, that means 1.5. Anyway, after we finished, you're going to hate me for this. After we finished, Rob handed Paul the keys and asked if he wanted to drive. You know what came to mind? For those of you that have read Merton, you know that Merton only got one chance to drive. And he totaled the company Jeep on the property. He was not allowed to drive ever again, I don't believe. Could be wrong. So there was with some trepidation that I watched Paul pick up the keys, and away we went. You can imagine my angst as Brother Paul got behind the wheel. When he told me driver's license weren't necessary at the monastery, I was ready to jump out of the car. It's only been recently that I found out that the man has one eye. Seriously, I'm not kidding. So I'm driving with this guy, and he's, for the most part, staying in the lanes. And he looks at me, and he literally looked at me, and he goes, "So how's the ride?" We get back to the dormitory. Paul looks at me and says, "You going to tomorrow's session?" At this point, my hands were probably quivering. And I said, "Yeah, I guess so." And he says, "I'll pick you up at 7:15. Don't be late." I wasn't late. Paul came. And I never thought in a million years that he would ever say yes to coming to Alaska. You are a special person, Brother Paul. For 60 years, this man's been praying for us. 60 years. This last July, if I remember right. Ladies and gentlemen, from whatever country you are from whatever continent you are from whatever your denomination is, I ask that you join me in welcoming Brother Paul.
Thank you, Wayne. The odd notion strikes me that I am now senior to my senior in the monastery, Father Lewis. Although he was much older by 25 years and entered the monastery long before me, I have now lived almost 25 years longer than him, and over twice as many years in the monastery as he ever did. For all that, I must say he got twice as far as I did in half the time. When he died, I felt among the things you might feel, I felt among other things a person might feel, a real thrill. A thrill of excitement that he had run the race and finished the course. There were certainly other feelings: dismay, shock, regret. But having watched his development over 10 years, I believed in his intense desire for God and his intention to complete and perfect his monastic life and Christian commitment. As it turned out, that was not to be realized as one would expect, and maybe it was not necessary in God's plan. Nevertheless, what actually happened in his death had a power of its own, literally shocking, which we live with to this day. It was not only, I was not the only one to feel a thrill. At the Bangkok conference, when Father Lewis died, they brought the news to his friend, Dom John Leclerc, who had invited him there in the first place. And Dom John said something that only a true monk would say. He said, "That is magnificent." That was his response to Merton dying in Bangkok. There is much that might have been if Father Lewis had lived, much that was never to be, and we as monks and readers might dismiss and forget those possibilities. I prefer to take them as important as valuable as gifts of his fertile imagination and spirit. He never became a hermit in Alaska, but think of that. Why aren't there many hermits in Alaska? Such a wonderful place for hermits. Who knows, maybe there may be more than we imagine, as you have suggested. There are already people here like that. And in fact, we had a novice who entered after Merton died, who, and not too long afterwards, left our monastery and came to Alaska to be a hermit at the invitation of Bishop Ryan. And he has built a hermitage. He had other dreams. He built an aluminum boat. He was going to be a hermit on a boat and go to the Aleutian Islands. He was a beautiful person and an artist, really. As happens with the idealistic type, it never actually eventuates to be a viable way of life. You have heard of many, many things that Father Lewis said he would do next. I have heard many of these things directly from people like the nuns at Redwoods Monastery in California. He was going to come back and live here. And the monks in Christ of the Desert said, well, he was going to come after his trip and live here. And there was a correspondence between him and Ernesto Cardenal in Nicaragua, a very serious discussion about him coming down and joining Ernesto. I have a suspicion that might have been the thing that actually would have happened, but that would not have been permanent either. Nevertheless, these things remain as some things somebody could do and ought to do. And in many instances, somebody already has done them, like Brother Carl Abel. And this plethora of ideas concerning what he would do next was endemic to Father Lewis's all-encompassing love for monasticism, its various forms, places, and histories. He once told me, as we were discussing some book, that when he reads about all those kinds of monastic life, he feels he wants to do them all. Evidently, he never ceased to live with this limitless desire. And after leaving Alaska, there were other places he visited and left behind a promise to return and settle down. I believe he meant them all. The people he told these, they believed it too. To do all of it would have been impossible. But at the risk of sounding a little kooky, I would say in the divine order of things, it is all possible, and it still is. There's something of the resurrection that happens already in anticipation, as when you sense the presence of somebody in a special place, in special circumstances. This is an experience of what the Creed calls the communion of saints. I regularly feel it in the Hermitage, the presence of Father Lewis in the Hermitage. And others are likely to say the same thing. One in particular was the great poet W.S. Merwin in a letter to me. Perhaps you have your own stories. Frankly, I am not sure Father Lewis could ever have lived as a hermit. could ever have settled down. It would likely have broken the mold of what he was and how he was. He was something of an intrinsically homeless soul. Notwithstanding, I do think he was called to desire the eremitical life and to seek it. That, I would say, was a way God had. That desire was a charism given to him for the church. Merton's vision, enthusiasm, and desire inspired women and men everywhere to delve into the solitary life. This kind of spiritual contagion had previously spread from his writings regarding the cenobitic life, life in a community in an enclosure, thanks to the Seven-Story Mountain, the Sign of Jonah, and many other books. The hermitage bug was already catching on at home before he ever entered a hermitage himself. And that was in 1965. Subsequently, 4 to 5 monks at Gethsemane became hermits full-time, including his abbot, Dom James, and our prior, Father Flavian, later to be recalled to community life and elected abbot. Besides these, I must not omit mention of the various part-time hermits, semi-hermits as we called them. On Tuesday of this week, I was reminded of another possible monastic track Father Lewis might have traveled. When in India, he was much impressed with the Tibetan monk Shatra Rinpoche and wanted to return and take training with him. His wife came to visit the hermitage, and I was privileged to escort her there. She was 25 years old when Merton visited Shatra, and she remembers following along as he showed him the various hermitages and the buildings that they had. And after all these years, 50 years later, she came to visit his hermitage. One of the visions Father Lewis had for his future was something I got caught up in myself, along with 6 or 7 other monks. We spent a couple of years trying to start a skete, or alara, a word from the ancient Egyptian monks. We imagined a small colony of hermits located on an isolated part of our property where we could build hermitages, a central house, and a chapel. For a charter, we had a rough draft of an outline by Father Lewis called Project for a Hermitage, which was in fact a project for hermitages, something organized under the auspices of the Gethsemane Abbey. Later, he had abandoned this concept when he had been given his own hermitage near the monastery. But not long after he died, the idea revived with support of Abbot Flavian, who was interested in exploring new forms of monasticism. And he was even considering perhaps pursuing that in in Alaska. The community, unfortunately, never supported the idea, and it died a natural death. Eventually, a Cistercian nun from Iowa and another sister successfully established a Lara in the next county, and they just call it the Lara. Elsewhere at that time, monasteries throughout the order began to have hermits on their property, as it had been rendered possible by modification of our Cistercian constitutions. Since then, much has changed. The confident, buoyant spirit of the 1970s and 80s has given way to a more focused and sharply defined understanding of our life as cenobitic. That is not one that excludes hermits, but it does not endeavor to encourage hermits. A few hermits remain here and there, but communities are trying to hang on to what members they have as numbers diminish. The current focus is on liturgy, good presentation, peace and order, and better communication and charity on co-responsibility. Some houses have returned to the practice of Lectio Divina in common, to being together more, being apart less. Merton is generally held in high esteem, and his place in the pantheon of monastic authors is obvious among Cistercians and Benedictine circles. You could say Merton has done his work in the Cistercian order. He helped effect a seismic shift from one model of the monastic life to another, from one that understands the life as penitential, strict, and hard, to a life that understands it primarily as contemplative and balanced. And Paul spoke about that in his discussion of Dom Frederick. He was not alone in effecting this shift. Several remarkable French abbots and writers had prepared the way. And in America, a generation of young abbots who grew up reading Merton carried the day at the general chapter, introducing a new era. The contemplative emphasis was carefully structured into the long, laborious revision of the Cistercian constitutions. That took place over 8 to 10 years in the 1970s and 80s. At this point, the keynote of our collective self-understanding in the Church is that ours is a contemplative way of life. A measure of this is the house reports of our community, the house reports that we at Gethsemane are listening to every day at dinner. You know, dozens and dozens of houses, just one per day, not every day. House reports are the public accounts each monastery gives of itself to the general chapter, where all the abbots and abbesses meet every third year. Almost unanimously, the reports start out by saying, "We live the contemplative life according to the rule of Saint Benedict, taking care to strike a balance between prayer, work, and reading." Generally speaking, the monasteries seem to be dedicated, are materially stable, are admired and respected by visitors of all kinds. The pity is that numbers are in decline. Recruitment is slow, and the workload increases with shrinking numbers and aging monks. Most houses are braving ahead and looking for a better day, for a generation that will catch on to what a beautiful thing we have. Meanwhile, a few monasteries are shutting down, one in America, and in France, our mother house, Melleray, has closed. One in Germany closed last week. And the 5 men's houses in Ireland are in a terminal condition. The one house of women in Ireland is doing much better. Generally speaking, the women do much better at monastic life. To some, this may sound terribly discouraging. Personally, I don't give it much of a thought. Most monks understand success is no measure of our worth. But if we do live the life as best we can, continue in dedication to prayer, liturgy, and community, blessings will come in God's own time, should God deems fit. If not, so be it. It was good while it lasted. Basically, one lives a monastic life for the sake of the life. In my recent memoir, In Praise of the Useless Life, I expressed something of this basic attitude in these words: life lived in God is sufficient. To do the chores and greet the smiles of others in it is a gift, a precious blessing. Gratitude becomes the intrinsic animation of prayer. To live in gratitude simply for being becomes the motif of life, liturgy, and mutual love. It serves no apparent purpose other than the hidden marvel of being in God. Our life is hidden with Christ in God. The meaning of love, according to St. Bernard, is love itself. Amo quia amo. Why do I love? I love for the sake of love itself. I love because of love. Amo quia amo. When I was a novice under the spiritual guidance of Father Lewis, I was looking for signs of spiritual progress in my soul. Father Lewis steered me away from that and advised me to live the life, to go to choir, do my work. Don't look at myself anxious and preoccupied. In a word, to live with simplicity. This was the very message he brought to Alaska, simplicity, and passed on to the Precious Blood sisters. In the recording made of his talks there, these are his words. There are 2 things that God is asking of us, but they are really one, and that is that we simply be men and women of prayer, people who live close to God, people for whom God is everything, and for whom God is enough. God is sufficient. That is the root of peace. We have that peace when God is all we seek. When we start seeking something besides God, we lose it. That is his call to us, simply to be people who are content to love, to live close to him, and to renew the kind of life in which this closeness is felt and experienced. From what I know of life in the monastery, simplicity comes easily for some. They move into a job, slip into a role, and carry on from year to year. Others are complex, and simplicity may be the work of a lifetime. Certain others are not just complex, they are complicated, and they never adjust to our life. They leave sooner or later. Merton was complex, but not complicated. And perhaps his answer to life was to go ahead and just be complex. If you are complex, the simpler thing to do is just be complex. That accounts for the many facets of his life, the relationships, engagements, writings, correspondence, and interests. At the bottom of this he must have been living with an awareness that in God alone could you find the unifying factor, the one love that unifies life into a deeper simplicity. Thanks to that, he could be much in the world without being of the world. Call it what you may, one must live in the monastery with what might you call an undefined something that you ever seek but never dare to define. As soon as you define it, you compromise it. It is rather something that defines you, and day by day takes you into the mystery. I wrote of this undefined something in a poem called Merton's Novices, in which I speak as if in Father Lewis's voice, a daring thing to do. I enter into reflections he might have had of the novices we both knew at that time, from 1958 to 1961. And here's the poem. Young men came looking for don't know what. Left the place looking for don't know what. Of these, I have no regrets. Some came, seemed like looking, heard some talk about what, stayed a while, and left talking like somewhat, or like what not. Serious young men came looking, took up talk about don't know what, stayed long and left talking about everything whatnot. Some came completely clear and sure about what. Those I sent away. Silent men came, a few came looking for don't know what, stayed, kept on looking, stayed, and never got to what, wore out, died, had never stopped looking for what. For these I have no regrets. All of these I loved, It seems the part I loved the best was don't know what. It was one of the privileges of my life to dwell in the novitiate and to develop under the care and discernment of Father Lewis. If I had gone to college first, it would not have happened. I knew it was a risk to enter right after high school, but it brought in a priceless opportunity. I was also privileged to be at Gethsemane at the time of his Passover to where he is now. I have been asked to speak of that occasion, and I do so at length in my memoir, In Praise of the Useless Life, but here I begin with the actual day on December the 10th, 1968. As weeks passed after his departure for Asia, Father Lewis mailed back brief items of news of the progress of his journey. The monastic conference in Thailand, of course, was to be the climax of his trip. The day came and went while we slept on this side of the globe. Of the conference, we never heard a thing until the community was seated at its midday meal. Then something unusual happened. After dinner was finished, Father Flavian walked to the reader's microphone, something he had never done before. He announced that a message had arrived that Father Lewis had had an accident and was dead. Details were unclear because telephone service was inadequate. No further information was available, even the exact nature of the accident. I immediately remembered how Father Lewis once told our novitiate class when he died, I'll need you to say a lot of De Profundis for me. Out of the depths, that's Psalm 129, one of the 7 penitential psalms. I left the refectory, walked in a daze to the church, knelt, and said all 7 penitential psalms, and said them with an intensity such as never before or since. Afterwards, I slowly drifted into the scriptorium, where the fathers and scholastics were quietly at their desks before noon. The scriptorium was located above the boiler room, where occasionally, at rare moments, a safety pipe outside the window released steam from the buildup of pressure in the boiler. As I entered the room, there roared out a white cloud of steam into the air, and immediately came the thought, Jesus exhaled his last breath with a loud cry, bowed his head, and gave up his spirit. That evening after Compline, I entered the darkened scriptorium again. Standing at the same spot, I noticed a holy card left on the table. I picked it up and dimly saw Father Lewis's handwriting, and it said, Caritas non deficit. Love never falls away. A message sent straight to my heart from an invisible hand. Those were St. Paul's words, but it was Father Lewis's message. At that time, after that time, seemed to stand still. And time stayed that way all week. we learned that Father Lewis died by electrical shock in moving a fan that had a shorted circuit. I spent a day and a night at Father Flavian's hermitage, settling into this new state of affairs. The sense of stasis lingered until his remains arrived from Thailand. It felt much like the days after President Kennedy was assassinated. Time stood still. The funeral itself began after a long delay as the casket was inspected at the undertaker's. Time weighed heavily. For the funeral mass, the casket rested before the sanctuary step and remained unopened. The selection for the entrance chant was an Old English hymn, "Now We Praise Great and Famous Men." Father Chrysogonus, our organist, asked me in preparation to revise the words, so I changed it to "Great and Worthy Men." I did not think Father Lewis would be keen on being celebrated for his fame, especially at a liturgy. At the entrance procession as concelebrants, procession of concelebrants, everyone surrounding me began to sing, and the beginning of the long-awaited moment was finally too much for me. I broke into tears, trying to sing as best I could through it all. Later at the offertory, standing to the far side, singing with the schola, I observed how the smooth, gray, sloped coffin nosed against the sanctuary step. It looked like a small gray whale with Jonah inside. Father Lewis swallowed up and carried back from across the world. And what kind of sign might this prove to be? A sign for now, I asked, and a sign for the future. After communion, when everyone was seated, a passage was read from the conclusion of the Seven-Story Mountains. It was a brilliant choice for the occasion, and though written early in Father Lewis's monastic life, seemed a synopsis of its entirety, even down to the present moment. At the end came these words, as if spoken by the Lord, words about bringing him to the Cistercian Abbey of the poor men who labor in Gethsemane, that you may become the brother of God and learn to know the Christ of the burnt men. It sounded like no less than a prediction of the manner of his death. Burnt, but with a burn that was electrical, and now his body was returned to the community of the burnt men. After Mass, final prayers were said by the graveside as the coffin rested in light rain. Father John Hughes was positioned at the head of the casket. As it was about to be lowered, he put his hand to his lips and touched his hand to the surface of the coffin. Then the coffin was lowered, and the signal was given for a token number of shovels of dirt to be thrown in. Father Raymond, a vigorous man and Merton's monastic senior, was given the shovel. He labored with such gusto that the abbot had to touch his arm to stop him. As he was a writer himself and of political inclinations that were different from those of Father Lewis, especially over the Vietnam War, some may have seen that action as reflecting rivalry. I saw it as rough Trappist realism about death and as an expression of years of camaraderie. When the community departed, I climbed a ladder to retrieve a loudspeaker I had hung in a red cedar, necessary to help amplify Father Flavian's soft voice. As I climbed up in the gentle rain and placed my arms around the trunk, the scent of cedarwood sweetened the sadness of the moment. So to conclude, I would like to recite another poem I wrote on the occasion of the anniversary of his death. I think it was about a year or two ago. It was last year, actually. Based on something that was said at the introduction of at the Mass about he passed 50 years ago. That he passed, that struck me. Well, that number counts for nothing. Better to say, subsists in the ever untimed. Years count not. No measure there is for boundless embrace of all time. Was, is, will be, coexist there simultaneously. Outside this, nothing is. Time inside this revolves. History is a closed circle, ever completed, ever changing. Wearily we count out years until counting proves of no account. Ours never diminished, but grown full in all time. We age in parcels, leave this behind, gain that a while, run headlong to bump into already. Smell afar the scent of beyond, staying in nothing but the unstayed. All time is being all together, a revolving disk with no outer rim, whose center is everywhere. Now you may have some questions for me, and also you might have some questions remaining for Kathleen Tarr, and so we'll open that as fair game. Is that okay, Wayne?
With everybody's permission, what I'd like to do first is to give all of you maybe 5 to 10 minutes, specifically with Brother Paul, in terms of questions you may have. And then I'm going to ask all of the speakers to come up here. And what I'd like to do is open it up to you folks for some time, reflection, other questions you may have of the speakers. You know, some of this is like drinking water through a fire hose. But you've let me be the fireman, and thank you for that. In any event, what I'd like to do is, again, maybe 5 or 10 minutes specifically for Paul, and then if there are, I'm going to ask the speakers to come up, and Kathleen, I apologize that I had to cut it off, but somebody told me I was supposed to be the drill sergeant today. So please, questions for Brother Paul.
I left them speechless.
The closing of monasteries grieves me very deeply. And I've actually spent time in retreats at Mimcan Abbey and in Conyers, so I have spent time around Trappist. My theology teacher always taught me that the renewal of the church always comes through religious life. So, in your opinion, the church obviously needs great renewal right now in the life of the church. Where do you see religious life, or how do you see new forms of religious life developing that might renew the church today?
Well, there are interesting things happening as far as new forms of religious life. For one thing, among the Protestants now, there's a great interest in monastic life, and some of them, they call it the new monasticism, and they're forming intentional communities. There's been the Communauté de Jerusalem in Paris, and now they have foundations in Toronto. Part-time, they live a liturgical life, they live together, and perhaps work in the town, in the city, and then come back. I think the real expansion in the order is actually taking place in the third world, places like Africa and Indonesia and Latin America. The really wealthy countries, there's a rollback, like Japan and Europe and America. So the order is expanding, but it's shrinking in some locations.
How many monks are at Gethsemane now with you?
Well, we have about 44. Maybe it's 45 now, because somebody just entered the monastery the day I left. We just had 2 young monks take their first vows a couple Sundays ago. So that's always encouraging. And there's some people expected yet to, come and stay.
I just wanted to say, it was like watching a movie when you were talking. I really liked your talk, and I guess I get confused when I go to movies too. But at one point, I'm wondering, why did you call Merton Father Lewis?
That's the way I knew him in the monastery. He was Father Lewis. We get a new name when you become a monk.
Far off the
He wasn't Tom. He wasn't Tom. He was Father Lewis, and I came as Richard, but I'm Brother Paul now. So we got a name change.
Oh, one more question though. Where's your poems?
Pardon?
Where are your poems? Do you publish poems?
Yeah, you can get them. Well, you can find them on Amazon.com. But no, my last book was called Unquiet Vigil. It was with Paraclete Press, and there's also other. I've published 6 books of poetry so far. So, and there's another one coming out next year. So, just dig around, you'll find something.
Hello. What is the current progress of Thomas Merton or Father Louis becoming a saint?
What's the current?
I've read different articles and things online, and I have my own feelings about.
I still don't hear.
About him, the progress towards him maybe becoming a saint.
I don't know. She wants to know if he's going to be canonized and what the process is, if that's moving forward.
No. I don't. I mean, there's no movement certainly at Gethsemane, and no movement in the order for that. I don't think he needs to be canonized. He's done his work in the church. He's a mentor for so many in the church and outside the church. I think it's sort of like Cardinal Newman. Newman he's getting canonized because his influence has diminished. So when Merton's influence starts diminishing, then maybe he'll be put on the calendar of saints. He doesn't need it.
There is a Protestant, well, mostly Protestant, small monastic community here in Alaska, a branch of the Iona community from Scotland.
Okay.
And I'm one of the two. The other one is Ian McGinnis Green, but he's leaving us.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I think Alaska will be a fertile ground for more of that stuff.
Could I do that with you? Okay. Anyway, hi. So I was watching this video with Father Richard Rohr, and he had gone to Gethsemane, and
Yeah.
he was talking to you guys, and I don't
Yeah.
know if you were there on this.
I was there, yeah.
So you know what I'm going to ask. So he said, he said the name of the great revered Thomas Merton, and you all kind of groaned. And he kind of went, well, that's not what I expected. And I guess somebody said to him, Thomas Merton once told us we weren't, you know the word I'm looking for.
Contemplatives.
You were just introverts.
We were just introverts. We're
That's
not
what
real
he said.
contemplatives. We're
Yeah,
introverts.
Yeah, just introverts. Yeah. So anyway, I was like, did that really happen? And where you were there?
It sounds like something he would say. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. It just would have been a quip that he tossed off, and some people are just too sensitive. And the rest of us would have understood what he meant and not take it all that seriously. I mean, there was something to it, no doubt about that. I think there are a lot of contemplatives in the monastery. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of contemplatives in the world, and they just don't know it
Yeah.
yet. And to the point about his sainthood, and you were talking about he would be canonized when he starts to be forgotten. I remember what Dorothy Day said. I don't want to be dismissed that easily. So
Yeah.
maybe that's kind of.
She said, "I don't want to be so easily dismissed."
Yeah.
And be made a saint.
Yeah, one more in the corner and then, yeah. A long walk around.
You shared with us your deep emotion at his death. So obviously you felt the great loss of a deep friendship. When I was a young priest here, Monsignor Kogel shared with me his experiences with Thomas Merton up here, and he said it was just such a delightful guy to be with. They shared beers and chatted, and it was just a warm, friendship that was instant. And I picked that up when I listened to his talks and things like that. But I appreciate your sharing your own emotions at his loss, and could you speak about your friendship a little bit more?
Well, it wasn't formal. Friendship has its own connotations. For me, he was my novice master and mentor. I think in friendship there's a kind of a parity. You have to be equal with the friend. I was never equal. I was much younger, and it was a structured relationship. When somebody is your spiritual director, in a way, it's better not to become friends, because then that compromises the situation. But of course, a lot of love gets transferred in this interaction. And I would say that's what I felt. I'm not even sure I think he liked me. His assistant complained that he liked me too much. I mean, I wasn't aware of that particularly. And maybe he had some premonition that, that I would turn out to be talking about him in Alaska. But we both like poetry, and I wrote a poem and gave it to him, and he posted it on the bulletin board, which really was a confirmation for me. And so he respected this little poem I had written, and then in an act of supreme detachment from my own, I tore it up and threw it in the garbage can. I wish I had that poem now.
I wonder if I could ask the other presenters to come to the altar. What I'm going to ask folks to do is, if you do have questions of any of the presenters, just please let us know who you're addressing the question to. Come on up, folks. There's also something hidden behind all of this. In a minute. Can we just say thank you to these folks? Once again, in a few minutes we'll adjourn, and there are food and drinks and everything downstairs. So, questions? No flowers, sorry.
Where's my question over here?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about technology and how Merton would have approached things like smartphones and tablets and Wi-Fi and just being plugged in all the time. It seems to me in some ways that plays on the worst of our monkey mind, constantly keeping it entertained and revving it up. I'm wondering, Brother Paul, do the monks have a policy? And two, what would you say, or what do you think Merton would have said about our modern state of technology and how busy and how active our minds are now with technology?
I think he would have said it destroys solitude, and that it's excessive. We don't carry wireless phones, smartphones around in the monastery. Now, there are other monasteries where they do that. Surprisingly, in Nigeria, I don't want to go there. I just don't want to be that available. Now, we do have more use of telephones than we did in his day in the monastery. It's more of an open system. A person can make a call. Now, if you follow the guidelines, which I don't do a lot, you're supposed to ask the abbot permission to make a phone call. I don't believe anybody does that, but it gives you at least something to aim for.